Good morning, everyone. Let's take a look at some updates as it relates to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. I'm recording this at 8:30 a.m. Central Time on Monday, October 16th, 2023. So additional news might come out after this is recorded and before it is uploaded here in a few hours. Israel says that over the last 24 hours, they have continued their air campaign over Gaza with an additional 250 targets struck. Now, a few days ago, I gave out a metric of over 6,000 bombs dropped so far in this campaign. And then we've also talked about number of targets struck, like Israel here, 250 in the last 24 hours. Those are different metrics, and you're always going to see one target could be on the receiving end of two or more bombs. So there will always, when you're looking at those two numbers, there will always be more bombs dropped than targets struck, if that makes sense. Now, the IDF put out a list of Hamas leaders that have been killed so far during this air campaign. We've already talked about a few on this list, Ali Khadi and Murad Abu Murad. Added to that, the IDF says that 4 additional Hamas leaders have been eliminated. They named Mutaz Eid, the commander of the Hamas Southern District of National Security, Zachariah Abu Ma'amar, the head of the International Relations Office in Hamas's political bureau, Joad Abu Shmalah, the Hamas Minister of Economy in the Gaza Strip, and Bilal Al-Qadra, the commander of the Nukba Southern Khan Yunis Assault Company. Now, it's worth noting that Hamas has not verified any of these. They're not confirming or really even talking about any of their fighters or commanders being killed so far, which is understandable for a couple reasons. On the one hand, they're not going to want to validate Israeli targeting and intelligence gathering to say you did kill the guy that you were coming after. The second is that the magnitude of these strikes has been pretty substantial over the past few days, and it's likely that quite a few within the Hamas organization have been killed. That's what would be expected here. And it's not exactly good for morale to every hour have to put out another press release that somebody else, another key leader from the organization, has been taken off of the battlefield. Now, the Gaza Health Ministry has put out that now 2,750 Palestinians have been killed since this bombing campaign kicked off, with nearly 10,000 wounded. That 10,000 did not come from the Gaza Health Ministry. Yesterday, it was, I think, right around 9,000, but gathering from a couple different sources, it's crept up by about 1,000, which kind of checks out with the pace at which this fighting has been ongoing. Again, worth mentioning that any information coming out of Gaza is likely vetted through Hamas before it is released. So you have to keep that in mind. Continuing on, rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel have continued. They have died down a fair amount. They peaked right at the very beginning of this war, October 7th, October 8th. But it's worth noting that the air campaign, the massive air campaign that Israel is carrying out over Gaza, has not stopped those rocket attacks from being carried out. The Jerusalem Post mentioned that they estimate that Hamas has only used 1/3 of their rocket inventory so far, which is crazy. That is a ton of rockets that Hamas has hidden and are still able to launch, which all points to the idea that the IDF, and Israel, if they really want to put an end to this terror emanating from Gaza, they have to go in. They have to put boots on the ground to actually weed this out. Now, the Al-Qassam Brigades, which is a military affiliate, kind of the military wing of Hamas, announced that 3 of their members had been killed after infiltrating Israel to the north. And we'll pull up a map here, but the area that they said they were approaching, they were supposedly attacking an Israeli or an IDF outpost when they were killed, is just south of the Lebanese border. So it's likely, these guys didn't come from Gaza and push north that far. They moved from Lebanon across the border into Israel, which we'll talk more about Hezbollah and their involvement here in a minute. But there is a connection there. There is a close relationship between Hamas and Hezbollah. And while Hezbollah has not formally entered the fight, at the very least probably facilitated or allowed Hamas fighters to stage in their area and move into Israel, as the Al-Qassam Brigades mentioned. Now, Israel put out some pictures and a press release of all of the items that had been recovered from the dead Hamas terrorists after their attack on October 7th across Israel. And it's wild, the amount of munitions that have been recovered. You've got anti-tank mines, tons of cell phones, medical equipment, operational plans. We've talked about that in a previous video. A lot of RPGs, anti-armor weapons, and then, of course, machine guns, small arms, grenades, things like that. But it was a sizable arsenal. Now, I know folks at times, right when this kicked off, were very quick to say, I see this type of weapon. I see a Russian weapon, or I see an American weapon. It must have come through X, Y, or Z. just looking at these pictures, again, it's a pretty wide-ranging arsenal from a lot of different countries. You have to keep in mind the number of conflicts that have raged across the Middle East over the last 20 years. It is not that hard for militant groups to get their hands on weaponry. So I would not take these images or the information coming out about different types of weapons used as clear evidence of any sort that they got them specifically through one nation or another. Now, moving on to the hostage situation, the last number I saw was upwards of 199 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Again, I want to stress, I feel like there's very little information coming out about the hostage situation. It's been over a week. We haven't seen proof of life videos. We haven't seen any pictures, nothing. Hamas is not talking about them other than the one mention from Al-Qassam a couple days ago saying that some of the hostages had been killed in IDF strikes. That's it. It's really just not on the radar. And personal opinion, kind of reading between the lines, it seems like the well-being and the rescue of those hostages is playing somewhat second fiddle to the overall overarching goal here of the elimination of Hamas. Again, personal opinion just based off of what we're seeing and not seeing in reporting. Now, I do want to point out, I got an email yesterday from a viewer. I'll leave their name out of it just for privacy purposes. But he brought up a really good point about the nationalities of these hostages being held by Hamas. So a lot of the graphics we're seeing are simply saying they're Americans or they're Canadians or they're British, whatever it might be. His point was the vast quantity of Israelis that hold dual citizenship very well could account for all of those foreign nationalities being listed on the hostage list. So it might not have been American citizens visiting Israel and they're trying to come home or plan to come home now, and now they're stuck in Gaza. There's a high likelihood, just based off of the volume of dual citizens living in Israel, that makes up the majority, if not all, of those different nationalities we see on the hostage list. Which, if that's the case, not to downplay it in any way, but if that's the case, it could be a little more understandable that countries around the world are kind of letting Israel take point here in terms of the negotiations, the release, and the eventual rescue of those hostages. Now, there was news that Israel has turned back on the water into the southern portion of Gaza. If you remember from early on, shortly after Hamas kicked off this attack into Israel, Israel turned off everything going into Gaza, into and out of Gaza. They shut off water, electricity, fuel, nothing, no aid shipments, nothing. And it sounds like now they're turning on water into the southern portion, which is also where Israel is asking civilians in Gaza City to flee ahead of what is largely anticipated to be a military invasion into the city itself. And it makes sense. If you're trying to get citizens to leave the north and move to the south, turn on the water to the south, get more people down there, move them out of the city. Now, there's been some mixed reporting about the Rafah border crossing in the south of Gaza on the border with Egypt. There were some announcements that for a period of time on October 16th, that border crossing would be reopened. It's been closed now for a little bit, reopened to allow for foreigners to leave Gaza and for humanitarian aid to come in. And big picture, on the surface, sounds like a no-brainer, right? Let the aid in to help the many civilians that are trapped in the middle of this war and allow the foreigners to leave. Seems like something we would do in any country in the middle of a war. But from Israel's perspective here, when they're able to shut everything off from Gaza, they have a much better understanding of what is getting in and what is not getting out. The minute that gate is opened, just trying to present the Israeli concerns here, the minute that gate is opened, it opens the door for the wrong things to flow in, to be smuggled in, or for some of that aid to be funneled to Hamas, the very people that Israel is targeting in this war. And then in terms of foreigners leaving, again, the minute you open that gate, you create the possibility to where Hamas leadership or anyone in their organization could find a way to exit Gaza, which would make it that much harder for the IDF to eventually completely eliminate the Hamas threat. Now, shifting back up to the north to talk about Hezbollah, there have been an increase in attacks, slowly but surely an increase in Hezbollah attacks against Israeli forces and then Israeli responses since October 7th. Now, over the last 24 hours, Israel carried out those strikes using their aircraft into Lebanese territory to strike Hezbollah targets, which raises a question about the Hezbollah capabilities. Now, Hezbollah and Hamas are very closely aligned in terms of ideology. In terms of capabilities, they're very, very different. So Hamas think, if you remove the rocket aspect that they have staged all across Gaza, it is largely a small arms force, right? Mortars, RPGs, machine guns, things like that. Hezbollah is much closer to an actual military. Artillery pieces, rocket launchers, tanks, BMPs, all sorts of things. So when we're looking at the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel, the Hezbollah leader a few years ago said that they had 100,000 people in their military. That's probably on the high side. Most estimates I've seen are closer to the 50 to 60,000 range. But that's a pretty sizable force. Right? I mean, Israel just mobilized their military and is saying they have 350, 360,000 ready to go. So you can't just brush aside 50,000 coming in from the north, even on the low side. And that's not counting the reservists that could potentially join their ranks. Additionally, when talking about some of the Israeli strikes into Hezbollah territory there in the south of Lebanon, there's an increased risk of aircraft being shot down. So Israel has complete air superiority over Gaza. It's not really even contested at all. That's not the case when you start looking at Lebanon. Militant Wire did a great piece recently showing some of the Hezbollah military capabilities in that parade and in that military exercise. They were just showcasing their man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, and they got a lot of those. So no shortage of man-pads. At the very least, Hezbollah has that capability. Now, there are some rumors about some other surface air missile systems that they may have. Now, if these were well known, I think Israel already would have tried to take these out, and they have tried to take these out at times in the past. But things like SA-17, SA-22, it's possible that Hezbollah has some of those. But either way, even if it's just the man-pads, the threat to Israeli aircraft when they're moving north and engaging any targets in Lebanon is substantially higher than it is during the war over Gaza. Now, shifting over to Iran, the Iranian foreign minister in a conversation with Al Jazeera said, quote, "If the measures aimed at immediately stopping the Israeli attacks that are killing children in the Gaza Strip end in a deadlock, it is highly probable that many other fronts will be opened. This option is not ruled out, and this is becoming increasingly more probable." Adding, if the Zionist entity decides to enter Gaza, the resistance leaders will turn it into a graveyard of the occupation soldiers. So this is very similar to the conversation we heard out of Iran just a few days ago, saying that there was a red line and that Iran would have to intervene if Israel moved into Gaza. I think it's easy for people to kind of brush this aside and say Iran's just talking a big game. They wouldn't actually do anything here. I don't think that's entirely accurate. I don't think Israel is brushing it aside. In terms of war plans for the IDF, one of their major war plans that they've got on that shelf that they're prepared to execute at any point is likely a ground invasion into Gaza. So what we're expecting to see carried out by the IDF is not something new. They would have known this is a possibility for years, for decades, right? So the fact that the ground invasion has not kicked off is worth taking notice of. Now, a part of that is they're still mobilizing resources. It's not about garnering international support, right? They've largely got that, enough of that to go in. Arguably, they would have had more on the 8th or the 9th of October, just after the attack took place. But there is a part of me that wonders if they are waiting to see a little bit more out of Iran and to see how some of these other nations are kind of posturing ahead of that invasion to see if that's going to end up being the best option. Again, personal opinion, I think that is likely. It's hard to see a scenario where the threat of Hamas terrorism is ever removed without the IDF actually going into Gaza. But again, hasn't happened quite yet. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if interested in national security topics, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.